your hand, go up. You know, go open doors. You said go be a boss. Amen. Amen. Every hustler gets paid. Where the hustle go come the pay. Your own in no go take. Amen. If you dey find work, do your own. God said go do his own. And flesh go cover bone. Amen. Amen. If you believe it, say amen. If you believe it, say amen.
We'll finish the song at the end of our session today. Welcome, everyone. Jabril, you want to begin the introductions today?
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Whatever time you're on, welcome to our next session. Congratulations, you're getting through the end of your first week. This is wonderful. And you all are still awake, alert, engaged. We love it. Today's session is our cultural connectivity session. And one of the things that is very critical to leadership, I mean, leaders have to understand the meaning of culture and the meaning of history, not only just in your own context, in your own local areas, but also globally and internationally. I mean, I think leaders who are not well informed about the meaning of history and culture tended to get a lot of things wrong, because history and culture informed is a very critical ingredient and component of what leadership is and who leaders are, particularly the leaders of the future. Now, today's session is very exciting because we have some wonderful speakers who are going to share with us different perspectives. I'm just going to quickly give you a rundown of who we have here, and we'll do more formal introductions to sort of help you. Today with us, we have, let me start with myself. I am Jabril Solomon. I'm a faculty member at Bridgewater State University. And my colleague, Dr. Megan Healy-Clancy, and I are going to be the two people who are the academic directors and coordinators of the program. And we are going to work together to run this program for you. With me today, we have some wonderful guest speakers, and we will go more in detail into their introduction. With us today is Ms. Lamerty Frazier. She is the Director of Education and Interpretations at the Museum of African American History in Boston, Massachusetts. I will come back a little bit later on after we will do more formal introduction for each one of them. We also have Dr. Joyce Lane Anderson, who is in our Bridgewater State University. Megan will introduce her more and say a little bit more about her. And Dr. Ian Sasson is also here, who's just joined us. And we also have Dr. Maggie Lowe from our history department. So this is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful group of people who will be sharing with us. So I don't know about you, but I'm excited, very excited to hear what they have to share. All right, without further ado, so the purpose of our program today is to introduce and to share with you, our African fellows, some of the cultural and historical perspectives about our region in the context of the American history and culture. So even though we're talking about locally what's happening in our region, it also gives you a context of how that all fits into the American history and culture from all kinds of different perspectives. So that's kind of the idea. Our format today is we're going to have our first speaker, who is Ms. Lamerty Frazier from the African American Museum, is going to do the first presentation, and followed by our other speakers. Let me go ahead and introduce Ms. Frazier to you all. Ms. Frazier, could you wave so you can kind of see, you all can see Ms. Frazier. She's very familiar with Africa and have done a lot of work in different African countries. Ms. Frazier is the Director of Education and Interpretation of Programs, Education, and History at the Museum of African American History, which is in Boston. She is also one of 3 artists who in 2016 was the City of Boston Artist in Residency in the mayor's office of art and culture. So she's an artist who does a lot of exhibit and shows and so forth. She's also a faculty lecturer. She teaches about art and history and education and even its areas related to STEM. And some of the selected work from Ms. Fraser's work is actually displayed permanently in the Smithsonian and the White House. So if you go to the White House and the Smithsonian and you're looking for some of Ms. Fraser's work, she has permanent work that is displayed at each one of those places. So she is just wonderful. So let me turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Megan, to introduce our other guest speakers before we jump into Ms. Fraser's presentation. Megan?
All right, sure. I'll be really brief because I know time is short here. So in addition to our wonderful presentation about Boston's rich resources and connections with African-American history, we're also going to be having 3 presentations that will continue some of these themes to do with African-American history, but also talk about the history of Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures in Massachusetts, the history of early colonial settlement, and then finally the particular experiences of women. I know this is a lot of material to cover in one hour, so buckle up. In the interest of time, you guys can feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along. I'm in charge today of paying attention to the chat questions, while Jabril will be carrying the weight of the oral presentation for today. So again, we're joined by 3 fantastic faculty colleagues of ours. You all know from your coaches already how fantastic our faculty is here at BSU. Joined first by Dr. Joyce Rain Anderson, who is the coordinator of our ethnic studies program. She focuses in Native American rhetoric and literature, and she does fantastic work on Native American history at BSU, as does Ian Saxene. He focuses on the early Native American history of Maine and has also done a lot of great work on New England history generally, as my colleague in the history department. And then finally, Dr. Maggie Lowe, who teaches a lot of great courses in the history department, including courses on African-American history. She'll be presenting today on some of her research on the history of women's education at Bridgewater and more broadly in New England. So let's go, looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Megan. And Ms. Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to say that I am thrilled with the diversity that I see of faces and geographies across this screen. And I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to join in this panel, and welcome to our fellows. Thank you so much. I will begin with a shared PowerPoint to acquaint you with what the Museum of African American History, in its coming to discuss the narrative of history that broadens American history, probably things that you have not heard before will be shared. And so as we go forward today, these are some of the people that we represent, and the buildings that would ground you in Boston, here on the campus of Boston, are the African Meeting House, built in 1806, here on your right, and the A.B.L. Smith School, built in 1835. Both buildings were built by free Black craftsmen who wanted a place to gather. And as we go forward, we also see that they came from a community in North End of Boston called New Guinea. They identified as African in both their African meeting houses in Boston and Nantucket. And we look at the home of a manumitted, formerly enslaved man, Seneca Boston, and the Higginbotham House here, built in 1774. Adjacent to it is another African meeting house built in circa 1820. So these were gathering spaces for communities that were identified as African, that were also called New Guinea in both places, and they had networks and organizations that kept them alive. So as we talk about this history, and I'm going to go kind of, we'll be probably speeding through this since we just have a few minutes, but we want to recognize that we are in the land of Indigenous people, the Massachusetts nation here, who through their descendants have kept this land, and we recognize them as our host, and we are their good guests. We want to look at how historically in the present, sovereignty has been stripped from the shared history of Black and Indigenous people here in North America, in over the past 500 years, and then look at the ability to then still look at belonging, to then still look at the intersectionality and the stories that are in the land and water, what the possibilities of that expansion give us in the narrative. As we look at, we know that there's this place of origin that all of us find as a common thread to all of humanity, if you will. And as we explore this notion, why come to the New World? Why are we looking at the advent of Christopher Columbus coming in 1492, the founding of Jamestown as the first English settlement, the 1619 Africans are in Virginia, but we know they have been to the Western Hemisphere many centuries before this and have had influence. But why do we concentrate on this period as the Pilgrims arrive and establish their colonies for their advance of freedom, and particularly religious freedom? In Boston, we are looking at 1638 as a marker of indigenous people who are traded for kidnapped Africans in the Caribbean. And they arrive on this boat called the Desire in Boston's harbor. As we look through this, we know that this is a diagram of people who have been put in spoon-like arrangements on ships against their will. And they don't know where they're going. They're separated from their families and the land that they know. And therein lies the crux of the problem in American history. This is what sets up this complex trade that is engendered through the crossing of the frantic Atlantic from 60 to 90 days to arrive in America. This is a diagram and a map of the triangular slave trade. As we know that there have been forts set up in the 1500s along Africa's west coast in about 8 different places. And the trade goes from there to South America, to North America, back again. And therefore that triangle is what we are concerned with and how the people arrive. You may have known this before, and pardon me if I'm redundant, but it kind of sets up a foundation for the kind of possessive thinking that we call white supremacy in most circles. But what I'd like to convey to you is this relationship of people to land and water. And in this dominant narrative of white possessive logic and thinking, it is as the Pilgrims arrive here, they see this land, they want to develop it, and what is going to do that development? Who is going to be in that labor force? And there has been a design set up to enslave Africans and bring them here to do this. So this dominant race theory that separates people by color and by race and by places of origin is what is operating in the Western Hemisphere. And it sets up these paradigms of property. Who is owning property by theft and kidnapping, land by theft and kidnapping of people, who is becoming propertyless as the indigenous people are dispossessed of their property, and then who is being deemed property. So as we go through this, the context of what is happening as this triangular trade is coming to America's shores and producing products and producing economy and producing trade, you have some laws that are being levied, and they are levied by those who are dominating the land and the water at the time. And one of the documents that gets presented is this 1641 Body of Liberties that protects the freedom and the liberties of the Puritans and the Pilgrims, while it limits the freedoms of others. So from Articles 1 through 90, you have those freedoms there to take care of widows and orphans and other property. But then when it comes to number 91, it announces that there should be no slavery except one is captured or one sells oneself into slavery. So by a show of hands, is there anyone here who would sell themselves into slavery? Sounds like a ridiculous question, but this is law, and it makes Massachusetts This body of liberties, 1641, makes Massachusetts the first colony in America to adopt slavery legally. So it is by law, by contract, that people are brought here to work. And the sale of them is something that engenders a history of slavery that does not end in America until 1865. Fortunately, Massachusetts, though it's the first one to adopt slavery, it does end slavery in 1783. So as we look at this timeline of slavery in America, we can look at the 1619 moment, and we can go all the way through that and the legalization of slavery in the colonies until the end of the Civil War, where what happens with 15 million people who are taken from Africa, and about 12 of them survived that Atlantic voyage. And by the end of the Civil War in the South, you have 4 million of them who are now found to make their way after being freed. And there's a succession of events that happen. So from 15 million to 12 million, and then the disposition of 4 million is what we are concerned with as we tell the stories in the Museum of African American History. The interesting marriage of slavery and publication is that in 1638, there is the desire that arrives with enslaved Africans. There is also in 1638, the arrival of the John with the first printing press that comes to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so you have the ability to print in that moment. You have the ability to publish. You have the ability to have an ad like this one, where we found at least over 200 ads that say just imported from Africa and to be sold at number 19 on the Long Wharf, a parcel of likely healthy Negro slaves. This was a common ad found in the newspapers. This is when it's from the Boston Gazette in 1761. At the same time that those are happening, there are also ads for people who are running away from slavery. In this particular instance, we have the publishing of an ad here, ran away from his master, William Brown of Framingham, on the 30th of September, a mulatto fellow, about 27 years of age, named Crispus. Ironically, this is Crispus Attucks, who is said to be the first man to die in the American Revolution. It is 1750 when he escapes slavery, and he goes to his mother's place because she is indigenous. She's Native American Wampanoag. Her name is Nancy Attucks, and she lives in Nantucket. So he runs to Nantucket and learns whaling, and he is on the sea for 20 years before the Boston Massacre, where he meets his demise. He is waiting for passage to North Carolina when he is involved in the melee on March the 5th, 1770. It is this that gives us the saying at the bottom, the first to pour out his blood as a precious libation on the altar of a people's rights. When we come to understand more about how Black people and Indigenous people are involved in democracy, they are involved in posing freedom, they are involved in gaining the rights through the lens of their experience for all Americans. And this is something that is not levied in the way American history is taught. So as an extra measure, at the museum and other archives and those explorers of archives like yourselves, we gain the experience of being able to expose the other stories that haven't been told. And one of them is about this man you see in the center. His name is Prince Hall. Prince Hall is an organizer. He is a manumitted African by 1770. His freedom is given to him by end of his contract and by Mr. Hall. He has also negotiated 1 day a week during his enslavement to have his own business in soap making and leather dressing. And as a result, he has some acumen about how to move about the society and negotiate business. So he takes in 14 other Black men, and they form a society called the Masons. It's an African Lodge 459. They apply for a charter here They are rejected here, and they have to receive their charter from Britain. They begin to operate a leadership organization that is committed to ending slavery, that is committed to the education of their children, that is committed to purchasing land and becoming citizens. And if not, they are posed to return back to Africa. They also form, for the advantage of women and children being with them, an African society. And it is that African society that gives them this organizational structure to be able to purchase land. They do fundraising through it. They have organization, agency, voice, and they petition the legislature for certain rights. They're not successful in all of that, so they have to fund their own freedom, if you will, but they are building community as they go. Meanwhile, there is a woman whose name is Maumbette, who was enslaved in Massachusetts. And in 1781, she asked, on the basis of what she's heard as she's serving people their tea and crumpets in these organizational meetings where they're writing documents like the Declaration of Independence, and she hears that phrase, all born free and equal, aren't I to be free? When she's accosted in the home where she's serving, she runs to an anti-slavery lawyer and asks him to represent her case. And her case, brought with another Black man, enslaved man, because women could not bring their cases by themselves, is won on the basis of all born free and equal. At that point, she renames herself Elizabeth Freeman. She amasses enough wealth through her occupation as a midwife and a domestic servant to have her own property, her own estate, to pay back her lawyer. And she leaves for her descendants money in her will. She's one of the first women in Massachusetts to own property and have a will. She then, it is discovered that she is the great-great-grandmother of a freedom liberator and scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois. And so as we look at this important event in Massachusetts history, the purchase of the land that the African Society is afforded to purchase in Beacon Hill, that tract of land on the North Slope, land that other people don't want, is what begins to this building that becomes a gathering space. Prince Hall and the men who were in leadership knew what they had to do to get to have the right to vote. They knew what they had to do to get to the right to petition. They knew what they had to do to build this community. And so they had this epicenter as this place of having those kinds of discussions. And out of that also come anti-slavery societies, unlike the New England Anti-Slavery Society that is in that building. It is purposed for church services, the education of children, and the assemblies to have abolition and the end of slavery. It is a point and a cluster of Underground Railroad activity and strategy. And one of the strategies is carried through the media. The newspapers that you see here, Freedom's Journal is the first African-American newspaper to be published 1827 to 1829. The next to it is the Liberator newspaper, an anti-slavery society newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, published every week, 1831 to 1865 without missing an issue. And next to that, you will see David Walker's Appeal, a free Black man from North Carolina who comes to Boston in 1825, establishes his own business, and he writes this as appeal to the colored citizens of the world, that there were not just Black people here in America, but they were united over the globe. And a bounty was put on his life for this document being published, $10,000 alive and $1,000 dead. And a year later, after it is published, he is found dead in front of his own shop. So this is some of what people that you see in this slide here are working towards as abolitionists. Some of them are very famous: John Brown, Mary Ellen Pleasant, the first Black man to own his own whaling vessel, Absalom Bossing in the corner here in Nantucket. They're dealing in real estate and property and all manner of Underground Railroad activity. And this is a story that is hard to put in such a small capsule, but we know that it leads to the Civil War. We know that there are Black troops that are fighting in the Civil War, acknowledged by the Emancipation Proclamation that ends slavery in 1863. We know that this is not over until 1865. And after that, people like Frederick Douglass are waiting for the end of slavery by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which deals with citizenship, the 15th that deals with the right to vote for Black men. So as we approach this, we want to say, as you think about African-American history and its experience in American history, we want to ask America, where are your monuments, your battles, your martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sir, in that great vault, the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history. And that's a saying by Derek Walcott, a poet, The Sea is History, written in 1979. So with that, I am opening for questions. And I hope I was able to make some sense. I know it was fast and in a hurry, but please forgive me for being not able to discuss everything, but this is what gives you some introduction to why we are trying to expand the narrative of African-American history and why 21st century tensions are happening in America. And what has not changed is the narrative. So that's our efforts.
Thank you so much, Ms. Frazier. We can stop sharing so we can come back to the gallery and be able to see everyone. That's a wonderful presentation. My goodness.
Okay.
Megan, do we want to continue to the next presentation and do questions, or do we want to get into the questions?
Sure, let's move to the next presentations and then do questions at the end, because I'm a little nervous about time. But thank you so much for that amazing presentation. It was wonderfully comprehensive, but amazingly succinct. I really admire that. That's great. All right, wonderful. Okay, and we do have one question in the chat, but Fred will come to that at the end of the session, and the other panelists might have some thoughts too. Okay, so now Dr. Joyce Ryan Anderson will be joining us, and you should be enabled to share your slides. There you go. Thank you, Joyce. Look forward to this.
Okay. Right. So, Winnie Kisak and KDPM, and thank you all for asking me. I'm very honored to speak with you today, and I come to you with a good heart. I thank my ancestors and elders for their guidance, and any mistakes are my own. I come to you from Bridgewater State, and I live in Brockton, which is right next door, and these are Wampanoag and Massachusetts lands, and we honor their continuous presence. And here we always say we must reckon that we are a country that is built on stolen lands by stolen bodies. My presentation is going to offer you some Indigenous history of the people in Massachusetts and surrounding territories, and what happened that became a template for what happened to Native peoples across the United States. So beginning with pre-contact, Indigenous peoples have been on these lands for tens of thousands of years. Contrary to what archaeologists have claimed, that Native peoples arrived here via the Bering land bridge, that Indigenous archaeologists and professionals have disproven this theory over and over again. A new book by Paulette Steeves points to the hundreds of published and peer-reviewed articles that date settlements well beyond 24,000 years. And she makes claims that archaeologists' knowledge have been produced and steeped in colonial ideologies that support manifest destiny. Let's see. Other theories of Europeans mapped out the lands of the so-called New World as terra nullius, or without people, again ignoring the rights of Indigenous peoples. First, in the area of Massachusetts, we have Nipmuc, Mohegan, Pecumtuck, Pennacook, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag nations, and they were located all over Massachusetts, and that's just this part of southeastern New England. The Wampanoag Nation consisted of 69 villages on southeastern Massachusetts and the islands. And of course, we cannot talk about this without talking about the doctrine of discovery, which has affected all of our nations, particularly the ways in which settler colonialism spread. And the doctrine of discovery results from a series of 15th century papal bulls, which granted the rights of explorers to representing European nations to claim the lands of native peoples and to, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all those who were not like them, taking away the humanity of indigenous peoples. And sadly, this doctrine is still used today in settling legal issues, most notably in 1823 in the Supreme Court Principle of Discovery of European Nations' Right to the New World, 1830 Indian removal, and most recently in 2005 to undermine the sovereignty of the Oneida Nation. Early contact along the New England coast also resulted in many devastating conditions, but I'm going to point to two. And in 1614, the taking of native peoples as slaves to be sold in Europe. These explorers came and resulted in luring their native peoples to their ships as to trade, but what they did is lock them down below deck and take them over to Europe. Thomas Hunt was notably the first person that we have evidence of to do this. In 1616 to 1619, due to the spread of European diseases, the Great Dying occurred, and that's what it's called by Native peoples. From Maine to Massachusetts, 60% of the Native population died during this pandemic. And then 1620 brings us the landing of the Mayflower and settler colonialism really digging in its heels in New England. Of the 102 passengers, 41 of them were separatists or pilgrims. The others that were indentured servants, the crew, mercenaries like Miles Standish also came, but it was the settlement of Plymouth Colony that really established a foothold in Massachusetts. Their plan was to settle in Virginia, but they first landed in Provincetown Harbor way out on the Cape, and then made their way to settle in Plymouth in 1620. They also signed a document called the Mayflower Compact, which wanted them to agree. It kind of ties in with what Mircea was saying about these documents that get signed and then become laws. So I really appreciated your presentation because I saw so many overlaps with indigenous peoples here. And once ashore, they were observed by Massasoit and his men. One of the things that made Massasoit a little bit more amenable to them coming was that they came with women and children. And so this was what caused him to approach them by sending Tisquantum in to greet them. And Tisquantum surprised them by walking in and saying hello English to them. However, Tisquantum was one of the people who was captured in 1614 by Thomas Hunt and had been brought over to Spain and then made his way to England and then made his way back home, only to find his village was wiped out by through the Great Dying. An agreement to offer peace was eventually signed between the two groups in 1621. However, it does appear a little lopsided as you start to really dig into the ways in which the English had advantages over the natives. And among other native nations in the area, the English did not keep their word, most notably when Miles Standish led a group to Wessagusset or Weymouth and murdered 2 Massachusetts men. And then in 1637 with the Pequot Massacre, where women and children and elders were burnt out of their village. The myth of Thanksgiving is also embedded in this time of 1621. The colonists were indeed celebrating their survival and their first harvest, and Massasoit and 99 of his men heard them. eventually going out and bringing in 5 deer to share in the feast of 3 days. However, the misnomer is that this was the first Thanksgiving, and that holiday was really not enacted until 1863, following the Civil War. In this area, Indigenous peoples have as many as 13 Thanksgivings throughout the year, and currently we're celebrating Strawberry Thanksgiving because it is the first food to gift itself after the long winter. In 1630, the Arabella arrives and brings the Puritans who settled in Boston who build their city on a hill. I want you to take a special note of the seal here and these words that say, "Come over and help us." This seal is based on the book of Acts in the Bible, where the Apostle Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia who said, "Come over and help us." And that indeed was meant to come over and Christianize us. And so taking this task to heart was John Eliot, who was given credit for his missionary work by being called the apostle to the Indians. He learned the Algonquin language, and he preached, although he wasn't very successful in his first outings and actually was laughed at, and went back to study more before he wanted to venture out and preach again in native language. He gathered a group of native men to translate the Bible and other texts. And this Bible, the Algonquin Bible down in the right-hand corner, was the first Bible that was printed in the lands that became known as the United States. He also set up these praying towns, and native peoples had to gather and live there according to English rules. And there's a whole list of them that are very interesting to read. But later, as a war broke out, they were forced onto Deer Island in Boston Harbor to go through a harsh winter with no food and very little shelter, and many died. In 1661, Massasoit dies and Wamsutta becomes a Sachem. However, Wamsutta is then forcibly taken to Plymouth, and on his way back home, he falls ill and dies. Many point to the fact that there could have been some kind of poison that he was given when he was in Plymouth. Metacom, or King Philip, the second son of Massasoit, becomes the Sachem. He is very resistant to the English attempts to control him, to acquire land, and he resists. In 1675, John Sassamon, who was a Nipmuc and an interpreter for Eliot and sometimes an interpreter for King Philip, was found drowned in Assawampset Pond, and 3 Wampanoag men were hanged and that fueled tensions for King Philip's War. Other things happened, and in 1675, King Philip's War broke out. Many atrocities were committed, and including the Great Swamp Massacre, which killed a number of Wampanoag and Narragansett women and children who were sent into the swamp to hide. Philip himself was killed in the Great Swamp in 1676. There he was drawn and quartered, and his head was put on a pike in Plymouth Plantation for 25 years as a warning to anyone who dared to go against the English. And finally, I just want to point to the resilience and resistance of Native peoples today. These communities still thrive despite these attempts to erase them. And their resistance to settler colonialism remains strong. The map in the lower right shows you the nations across Massachusetts. And I just wanted to also point out the seal up in the upper right, which is one of the ways in which Native peoples are wanting, not wanting, but resisting the settler colonialism, because they've now formed a commission to change that seal. Above the figure is an arm with a sword, which is said to be Miles Standish's sword. And given the kinds of the ways in which he treated Native peoples, there's a commission to be developed to hopefully change that seal and stop displaying that all over the place. So Katapatash.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joyce Rain. That was another fantastic presentation. And now my colleague, Dr. Ian Saxene, will be joining to provide a little bit more context on early colonial settlement and those transformations in Massachusetts. So go ahead, Ian.
Thanks to all the fellows and to the organizers and to my my colleagues for these great presentations so far. I'm going to be talking as briefly as I can about the 17th century colonization of New England, what it actually involves, and then the both real and mythical legacy of the English colonization of this region for everybody in the in New England. And I appreciate my colleague, Ms. Frazier, talking about the changing narratives. And so I'm going to talk a bit first about the historical narrative as best we can, and then how that was transformed into various mythological ones. First of all, in reality, the colonization of New England, what became New England by the English, was very unusual compared to most English attempts to colonize overseas regions in the Western Hemisphere. This didn't mean, now later New Englanders either made the argument, and some Americans agreed with them, that in fact New England was the cradle or birthplace of the United States, or that it was somehow exceptional. But it was unusual, and that was for a couple reasons. So first of all, New England, the English colonization of New England began in earnest in 1620 with a group of people who later generations called the Pilgrims, but who never in fact called themselves this. The Plymouth colonists who arrived in 1620 and the people who followed them were generally a group of, they were religious utopians in many ways, where these were deeply motivated Calvinist Christians who were very proud to be English, but were in fact so Protestant and so Calvinist in their worldview that they clashed with the prevailing Church of England. So much that they believed they could not safely stay in England. Now, if these people had actually been seeking religious freedom and true toleration, they would have stayed in the Netherlands, where they were tolerated. But like many immigrants to many new lands, they in fact didn't want to lose a sense of where they came from and who they were. And so these early religious separatists, who later generations called the Pilgrims, they found that their children were becoming Dutch. When some of them fled to the Netherlands, and they didn't want that. And so they thought they could more safely stay English by going overseas to what they first thought was going to be the northern fringe of an English colony in Virginia. Okay, now New England was unusual for several reasons in terms of this colonization process, though. So first of all, most of the colonizers were motivated by, in the early generations, religious idealism rather than purely a search for profit. Although certainly many English people hoped at this time to own their own land, which in England in the 17th century was for most people the prized goal of economic self-sufficiency. They called it competency, the idea of owning one's own land. But also the English who arrived in what became New England, besides being motivated by religion, they built a society that was relatively egalitarian in terms of in terms of the difference between the richest and the poorest. There were some poor people and in fact enslaved people in New England of African and Native American descent from some of the very earliest years, and we need to emphasize that. But for reasons of geography, the English who arrived in what became New England were not able to build large sugar or tobacco or other plantations that could profitably use large amounts of enslaved labor. And so the society that emerged in New England was relatively less gap between rich and poor. And it was populated by an initial burst of arrivals and then very few other people for almost a century. So between 1630 and the early 1640s, about 25,000 people, largely arriving in family groups, came from England to what they began calling New England. And then after the mid 1640s, very few people joined them. And instead, these families proceeded to reproduce at a heroic pace, in this sense, actually mimicking the French colonizers in Canada, where large numbers of people are descended from a very few families. And New England, unlike most of the English Empire, had very few immigrants or new arrivals. And in fact, New England was the most xenophobic, afraid of foreigners of any corner of the Eastern Seaboard well into the 19th century. Which is ironic because then around the time of the American Civil War, New England became in many ways the #1 destination for immigrants from many parts of Europe. But this was not the case for the first 2 centuries of colonization. Now, why did this matter in terms of the kinds of society these people built? Well, first of all, these Calvinist Protestants were very insistent that everybody learn how to read the Bible for themselves. And they placed a great emphasis on having educated ministry. And so one of the first things the colonists did is they founded a college, Harvard College, the oldest English language college on the Eastern Seaboard. And to this day, Boston has the highest, it is the best educated city in the entire United States, except for Washington, DC. And it has one of the highest concentrations of institutes of higher learning. And that has been, I don't want to be reductive and say it was just they became, their opponents called them Puritans, and these people eventually adopted this label. I don't want to be reductive and say it was only the Puritans who did this, but they started this legacy, this emphasis on education, and the society that these religious utopians built. They did not believe that religious toleration was good, because that means that your side lost. That meant that you could not institute your own God's vision of a good society. And what these people were trying to do was build a model society according to what they believed God wanted them to do, that was so good that everybody back home was going to do what they did too. That was the idea. And by their own metrics, they failed. And it's important to realize that, okay? By their own metrics, these people failed. And gradually this godly vision that was built on, again, a community of like-minded people watching each other and helping each other stay on the straight and narrow, gradually failed. But in the process, they did build a relatively stable society that was broadly prosperous for people who were not enslaved. Okay. Now, in terms of some of the myths that grew out of this society and so we should add the rest of the English Empire, reliance on slavery and indentured servitude was the norm. And again, it was not absent in Massachusetts or New England, but it was much more marginalized. Society was more turbulent. There were it was much more diverse, different religious groups, different ethnic groups churning through. New England remained largely, although not exclusively, English, with a minority of African and indigenous people there. Okay. In remaining, we should add, in the emphasis on being English, this English pride, it was also tied to property. I want to touch on that for just a moment as well. And that is to talk about some of the myths that grew out of the so-called pilgrims who arrived here in 1620, okay? Now, these people were the most extreme of the extreme. They were so Protestant that they believed that the English church wasn't godly enough. So they broke away from it, which was an act of treason in 1620. These people, again, by their own, they were so extreme, they believe they failed. Most of their own community did not join them in Plymouth in 1620. And in fact, it never did. Their minister, John Robinson, who they had been waiting for to join them, he was deeply disappointed at their resorting to violence and the assassination of several Wampanoags in the 1620s to they believe, protect themselves. And Robinson said, blood once shed does not wash away. I fear this will be difficult. And so by 1630, the Plymouth colonists, the separatists, had only grown to 300 people. And their colony was going broke and foundering. And it was only this later wave of Puritans who did not want to break away from the Church of England who saved Plymouth Colony. Plymouth Colony never had a legal right to be where it was. It never got a grant from the king that said, you're okay, you have a legal right to be here. And Plymouth was absorbed into Greater Massachusetts in 1691. This is very important to note, that one idea of that European imperialism was deeply legal and methodical, as opposed to oftentimes haphazard and improvised. Now, what the English really thought made them special in the 17th century, even more than color, and in some was two things. Christianity, but also their form of property. And so for the English colonizers, English people were the best, better than Irish, better than Yorubans, better than Wampanoags, because of the way they used the land and because of the way they farmed and quote unquote improved it. And this, in fact, even made them better than Europeans. And what the English tried to do when they went to the Americas, and in fact, when they went to Ireland, besides taking land for themselves, is say, well, we're going to teach everybody else the way to use the land correctly. And so the story of English colonization in the 17th century was reconciling themselves to these different metrics of property ownership, which they believed to be inferior, but which they often had to accept, at least for a time being. Quite honestly, because sorry, we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time. But thank you. That's great. I think that provides some fantastic context here.
Right.
So let's move in now to Maggie's presentation, which will take the story up a little bit closer to the present. And yeah, then we can hopefully, we may run a little bit over time if people need to leave at the hour mark. That's fine. But stick around if you can for the very end of our session. Go ahead, Maggie. And you want to share your slides? You're muted, Maggie. There you go.
Thank you. I'll do it just a moment. I'll share them. I've got share screen. Thank you. I just want to say good afternoon. Wonderful to be with everybody, to be part of already wonderful array of presentations. I want to give a nod to Professor Wing Kai To. He is our Assistant Provost of International Engagement, and a good part of my presentation, or part of it, comes from his research on early international students. So I wanted, if you want to know more about that piece of it, I'm sure he'd be happy to engage you in conversation. I will move through my slides quickly, and I am happy to offer my slides via email to anybody who would want them. But for the interest of time, I'll just move right through. That's my intention, at least. Okay. I just put this title of my book here that was published quite a while ago. It's still in print, but if you want a little bit more information about the particulars of my interest, which was college women post-Civil War and body image, you can check that out. So this is Bridgewater, our campus today. We so wish you were with us on campus, but we're delighted to have the Zoom as a backup. We've been so honored to have the Mandela Fellows with us. And what I wanted to point out again, this is a research, I wanted to give you a little bit of history of Bridgewater State University rather than go right to my very particular research, because I thought it might be helpful for you to have a little background about where you're zooming into and our history, which is quite distinct. I am drawing a lot of this research from a book called Not to be Ministered Unto, but to Minister, Bridgewater State University, 1840 to 2021. That was written by Professor of History Emeritus Thomas Turner and published in 2012. And you may see, you may run into that. It's a wonderful picture book. But again, there's a lot of wonderful information in there that I pulled some of this from. The first thing I just want to give you a little bit of background. We were a Horace Mann, he was a educator that was dedicated to teacher education and a person of prominence in Massachusetts. He was appointed the first Secretary of Education of Massachusetts in 1838, and with a mission to found what were called normal schools. They were called normal because they were in these schools, you were taught the normal curriculum to then go forward and be teachers of children. At the time, public school was available to all students, white students in Massachusetts, and there was a dedication early in the state to educate its citizenry, partly coming out of what Ian was just talking about, the idea that it should be a literate population so they could read the Bible in the early colonial times. By 1840s, it was considered a public good for the new nation. So it was the third normal school in Massachusetts. It was founded first in Old Town Hall, one schoolroom, 7 men and 21 women. I wanted to point that out because right away you see a gender configuration here that's striking. And partly it's because Bridgewater, like so many of the early colleges and early institutions of higher education, even early seminaries for women, were used this idea called maternalism. And that phrase was coined later by historians, but how I want to use it here is just this notion, which could be quite conservative and quite essentialist, that women are naturally, either God-given or biologically given, more nurturing and more have a greater affinity for children due to God or due to biology. Now, women were smart, like other people have really emphasized today. We're looking at the agency of peoples. And what they did is they turned that on its head and said, well, if we're so good at nurturing children, therefore we should have a public role rather than just a private domestic role. And so advocated, they were very active in all the 1840s reform movements, including women's education, which is where a lot of the reform movements, abolition and so forth, women's rights and women's education all came out of the 1840s, 50s. So a couple of women right away, we can look at these, first women that came out of Bridgewater Normal School. Abby Diaz was a very famous women's rights activist. The alum Mary Cragen was the first normal school woman principal in the United States, or assistant principal, and she did that in St. Louis, Missouri. So right away we have women making their mark. We have women as a dominant population at Bridgewater Normal School, and we have them using maternalist philosophy to argue for a public role, and leadership roles, which would have been considered masculine, if not identified as to nurture and grow children and therefore grow the democracy. All right, I also wanted to mention Sarah Lewis. This is with Tom Turner's amazing research, as well as Professor Wing Kai To. She was our first documented person of color, 1867, so just right after the Civil War is when we have a documentation of her enrolling, and believe that she was here until 1869, and she goes on to be a normal school teacher. We could say a lot more about that. And then I pulled in a slide for my own research, which is post-Civil War, and I looked at Spelman College, Cornell University, and Smith, because I wanted to do a racial and class co-ed single-sex comparison of how late 19th century college students thought about their bodies, because so much of the debate about whether or not women could go to college was put through the frame of the body. But what I wanted to show with the Spelman slide is you can see how formal they are. And you see this a bit with the Sarah Lewis portrait as well. And for African-American women at the time, the key was to use what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the historian, calls the politics of respectability. If we can claim that we are respectable ladies with our bodies and our appearance, therefore society, you need to treat us as such respectable beings and therefore be protected from violence and slander. This was an effective strategy in some ways, and of course limited in others. But you can see just how the tight corsets, the high collars, the hair back, the umbrellas. This is a very formal stage photo, and it was used for money raising, to fundraise for the fledgling little Spelman Seminary in the 1880s. And then I wanted to just highlight some international students because I thought that would be of interest to you as international scholars. And this is the research that I mentioned that Dr. Wing Kai To can tell you more about with Shuji Isawa. I believe I have that, I hope to have that close. He's the first student that we have from Japan, and we have a long history of having Japanese students on campus. In 1898, Bridgewater accepts their first Mexican students, and by 1890, so quite early, we have students enrolled from Canada, Jamaica, Mexico, Syria, Armenia, Turkey, and the Ottoman Empire. And then back to BSU today, you can see this a bit on the homepage, but just facts to think about. I mean, from that one room schoolhouse, today, we still have this dominant female ratio. It has not always been, but now it's 4 men to 5 women. So it's about a 60-40 split. And a lot of the women today continue to go into the field of education, although we are now have a university where we see women across the board in terms of what we would have traditionally called male majors, you know, in the past, things like accounting and finance in the STEM fields. But it's interesting campus in that way. Of course, that's reflecting larger national trends as well. Bridgewater has a total enrollment of almost 11,000 students today. If you haven't picked this up in some of the materials or fun facts, you know, this is a little bit, gives you a little bit of the scope. And you can see how modern, this is one of our dormitories and dining complexes on campus. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. And then I just wanted to make a little bit of a bridge to the later activism of women coming out of Bridgewater. One of our most famous graduates is Alice Freeman Palmer. She becomes president of Wellesley College, which is one of the 7 sisters, at age 26. So I like to tell that to our students as inspiration. But she takes on Wellesley. She actually had quite a turbulent term there, but she is one of the founding presidents. And as you can see here, the 7 sisters, this is one of our feathers in the cap of Massachusetts as well. 4 of the first 7 sisters, they're called 7 sisters because they were the first 7 institutions of higher learning founded for women in the late 19th century. We have Mount Holyoke as a seminary in 1837. It doesn't become a college until the 1880s. Smith in 1871, Wellesley here 1870, Radcliffe College, which is the sort of annex of Harvard, 1879. And then you have the other 3, 1816, 1891, Vassar, Bryn Mawr, and Barnard. But we can claim 4 in Massachusetts, and we claim the first president of one of the 7 sisters right out of Bridgewater Normal School. And I'm just about done here. I wanted to just say, end with a little bit of fun. We're talking, you know, there's so many hard issues today, but one of the ways that opponents of women's education argued that they should not be in higher institutions was about their bodies. And then one of the famous quotes here is by Edward Clark, 1873. He publishes a book, and this is widely believed at the time. And he said that that citing a girl's failed attempts to undertake academic work, he warned, quote, "A girl could study and learn, but she could not do all this and retain uninjured health and a future secure from neuralgia, uterine disease, hysteria, and other derangements of the nervous system." So it's kind of humorous, but you know, I often joke when I was in graduate school, I thought that maybe it was true. But as you can see, it was a very biological argument. But you know, one of the ways, and then we see this is like a slide from Cornell, a way to also argue that if they go into institutions of higher education, you might have the beauty here. She was, you know, sort of piped in a debutante, but this is the Cornell co-ed, the student, and she looks quite masculine in her bloomers, and she was called the thing. So you see the sort of, you know, opponents, but one of the best ways, this is the fun slide, that women fought back is they said, well, if you think we're going to become ill and fall apart, we're going to prove you wrong. We're going to be healthy and we're going to be robust and we're going to eat and we're going to play basketball. And this is what they had at Smith. They were called spreads, and they'd have tea and jam and invite each other and be in their bedclothes and study late into the night. So we think about this today. It's a familiar student ritual. But Smith students use this very effectively to say that, look, we're healthy, we're robust, we can be in the institution of higher education. And Smith had a traditional curriculum that they modeled on Amherst College, so there was no fluffing it for women. And they advocated out of that ideology that they belonged in public life and were quite successful. I will stop my share there, and thank you for your attention at the 3-4 presentations all right in a row. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. I will just do a little round of applause quietly on Zoom. I think these introduced us to some really rich themes in not only the history of Boston and Massachusetts, but indeed the history of America more broadly. right? As all of our presenters gestured toward. There's this sort of core idea, right, that Boston and New England is sort of one of the birthplaces of American democracy and all of these wonderful ideas, right? And as we've learned today, right, these ideas of democracy historically have not included everyone, right? Down through the present, people are fighting to make these ideas more expansive, more inclusive, and we've given you just a little taste of what that history has looked like. Charles had a really great question about sort of what are the lessons of this, right? And I responded in the chat here. I think one of the lessons that the history of Massachusetts might give you as African leaders is thinking about how people have historically pushed, right, to make ideas of freedom and liberty more truly inclusive, more representative, and more transformative, right? And so, Ms. Fraser's presentation brought up the important role of activists like W.E.B. Du Bois. If you don't know his work, you should definitely check it out. He ended up spending the last years of his life in Ghana, so his history really bridges African American and African history. I could go on, but there's a lot of fascinating lessons, and I really appreciate your questions and comments in the chat. Yeah, and on the specific topic of Maggie's presentation in the women's schools, Ian noted that he went to Vassar, right? That a lot of these women's schools now include men as well. And so these institutions, and they also include, gender non-binary people. So there's a long story of these inclusive transformations we've seen here. Okay, so I know we're a little over time. Jabril, did you want to make any concluding?
No, I just would like to invite maybe one or two fellows to quickly ask a question to any of our panelists so we can hear a little bit of your voices before we close.
Mhm.
So if I don't see any hands raised, just raise your hand or just unmute, and could be a question or a comment. Anyone?
Yes, okay, so let's just take a question.
Cornelis, yeah.
Okay, yeah, Cornelius and then Rosina, great.
Yeah, hi. So I think it's really been educative learning about Boston. I will be in Boston this fall because I have a master's at Harvard. So it's been really good to really listen to all this. And now I have a few places that I have to visit when I'm there, definitely. So it's been really educative, and I really paid so much attention to everything. So thanks so much to the panel and everybody for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and certainly the African American History Freedom Trail is especially fantastic. That connects with a lot of the sites that Ms. Fraser's presentation highlighted. Rosina?
If you're looking for something also really old near Boston, Salem, Massachusetts has one of the greatest collections of 17th century still standing buildings. Beautiful. It was also